Hey class, as we're beginning to wrap up our reading of the Republic, I want to close out with a brief overview of the movement and the argument of the 10 books because it can be sometimes difficult to see how they all hang together. So we begin in book 1 with a debate about justice. And in this debate, not only the definition of justice, but ultimately the very existence of justice as a real thing in the world and as something that, if it is real, would be desirable, is sort of put into question. Socrates is very committed to defending the idea that there is such a thing as justice. We can know what justice is, and that it is better to be just than unjust. And that is what the argument of the Republic is going to attempt to persuade us of. Right? As the argument develops, Socrates says that it's going to be very hard to figure out what justice is for an individual person because we are so small. It'd be much easier and much better to try to figure out what justice looks like in a city. And then once we understand that, we can sort of read it back into the smaller sort of justices of a human being. This is where there's a constant debate amongst the readers of Plato about whether the Republic is a work of what we'd call political philosophy, a work of ethics, or if you think about the analogy of the cave and the divided line, maybe even metaphysics. It is arguably all three, but it's probably least political philosophy, and I'll tell you why right now. The city that Socrates and his friends begin to discuss and sort of basically build is, as they repeatedly say, a city in speech. It is not a city that is meant to actually exist in the world. Right? There's a point where Glaucon wants to sort of basically start the revolution and build this city of justice that they've been describing, and Socrates tells him to slow down and that he's missed the point. Right? He says to Glaucon that if a geometer was, describing these perfect shapes in great detail, we wouldn't expect that the geometer would necessarily go out and draw them or that those shapes would exist in reality. Right? The point Socrates tries to explain to Glaucon in describing this city of justice is not to actually have a just city, but to know what it would look like if we had one. Now, the question might be, well, why is it that we can't have one? Why is it that we can describe this city of complete justice, but we can't have it? And that's an interesting question, and it's one that it's worth you taking a lot of time to reflect upon, both in terms of Plato's text and also in terms of, maybe just more generally, that perhaps one of the lessons of Plato's Republic is that this perfectly just city, not only is it not something that we can have, take that for granted, that the city that Socrates describes isn't really practical, right? That the various schemes that he has for building this city and running it and educating it are probably not schemes that would work in real life. But suppose that they did. Would any of you want to live there? Right? This is a city that micromanages nearly every aspect of every person's day, right? It micromanages what job you're going to have. It's assigned based on certain aptitude tests. It micromanages what sort of music you're allowed to listen to. And we're not talking here just about, censoring objectionable lyrics. There's a point in the discussion of the education of the Guardians where they're actually going to censor certain rhythms and certain sort of melodies and things, because Socrates thinks that they are bad for the soul. They have, various other schemes that are, very impractical. And this all culminates in Book 5 of the Republic, where we get the three waves that involve, again, various impractical ideas such as not having any families. Ultimately, the culminating point of this is the philosopher king, which is meant to be, although a lot of commentators miss this, is meant to be something of a contradiction. The philosopher would, once the philosopher is described in the analogies of the divided line and the cave and things like that, it becomes quite clear that the philosopher would be a terrible king. And so the philosopher king itself is which is often taken to be like the essence of Plato's political thought, actually indicates the impossibility of having this perfectly just city. And I'll explain why in a minute. The city that we've been building then, right? The city sort of beginning with the noble lie and running up through the education of the guardians and the three waves in book 5, culminate into this discussion of education and the divided line in books 6 and 7. And this is where we get the image of what the philosopher king would look like, or at least what the philosopher would look like. And this is where we get Plato's idea about the forms. Also, in some translations, you might have it be the ideas. Forms, ideas, same thing. The Greek word is eidos, which is sometimes just transliterated as ideas, but more often than not translated as forms, both of these with capital letters. The philosopher, as it turns out, is only interested in the forms. The philosopher is not interested in the particular things around them. The philosopher is just sort of interested in these sort of, what we might call like abstract realities. So the philosopher wants to go up the divided line, as you studied, right, to have knowledge of the forms, which are sort of these universal things. Like one way to think about it is in terms of geometry. The philosopher is not interested in particular circles that it might find in the world, like the circle you draw on the blackboard or the circularity of, the tires on your car or something like that. The philosopher is interested in the form of the circle. What is circleness, right? What is it to be circular, right? But not any particular individual circles. So the philosopher is interested in, to use Plato's example, beauty. What is it? What is beauty itself? What is the beautiful? But the philosopher is not interested in any particular beautiful things or people, right? This is why, the image of sort of the absent-minded professor of the professor that their head is in the clouds and they're always thinking of, professor things and they can't see what's going on right in front of their face is actually rooted in Plato's description of the philosopher. So the philosopher is interested in all of these very abstract things, not what's going on in front of them. Well, if you think about that, that person would make a terrible king, right? That person would be an awful king. And they would not be interested in the sorts of things that a ruler has to be interested in, right? A ruler, let's say I'm mayor of Denton, I have to be interested in fixing potholes and, replacing traffic lights and, the various other things that go with running a city. The philosopher has no interest in any of that. So the philosopher would not do a good job at it. So the philosopher king that Plato says is sort of the necessary condition for the existence of a city of perfect justice is actually a contradiction. A philosopher could never be a king on this planet. And the philosopher would, if the philosopher was a king, the philosopher, would ruin everything. They would be a terrible king. They wouldn't actually be a good king. So part of the lesson of Plato's Republic is that this city of perfect justice that we might imagine and that we might describe can't actually exist, in the same way that a perfect circle can't actually exist, in the same way that a frictionless plane, well, I don't think frictionless, I don't know, Shit. So the perfect city, the beautiful city, the Calopolis, the city in speech, can't actually exist. Glaucon is depressed by that, and or at least he is temporarily, but he gets over it. But then we might say, well, why talk about this? Why have this whole discussion of this city that can't exist, and so on and so forth? There are two reasons. First reason is that it gives us a standard, right? By knowing what a perfect circle looks like, you then have a standard by which you can judge the circularity of other things, right? So that we know that a perfect circle is supposed to be 360 degrees, right? And once we know that, then we can say that something that is 355 degrees is more circular than something that is 280 degrees, right? So we can use this ideal of the perfect city as a standard by which we judge actual existing cities, but we don't expect that this city would ever actually be, instantiated here on Earth. So that's the first reason, right? Even though we can't have this city, it gives us a standard by which we can judge the cities that we live in. But we have to sort of temper that judgment with the understanding that just as it's impossible to freehand draw a perfect circle, it's going to be impossible for a perfect city to exist. Every human situation that we find ourselves in is going to have something that is disappointing, something that we don't like about it. And this is why when Plato is talking about the 4 or 5 other forms of forms of constitution, we have to keep in mind that the topmost form, the best form of the city, is again an impossible one. So second reason why this is important, because remember the whole point of the discussion of the perfect city and the just city was so that we can understand what justice looks like in the soul of the individual person, right? And it's an interesting question it's an interesting question to say, since the perfect city is impossible, is the perfectly just person also impossible, right? And I don't think the Republic is as clear on that point as it is on other points about, let's say, the impossibility of the perfect city. But I think that there are good reasons to think that the perfect person in the Republic is also somewhat impossible. So what is the perfect person in the Republic? What does justice look like in the soul? If we go back to Book 4, the official definition of justice is doing one's own work. So justice in the city is when each part of the city does its own work. The ruler rules, the guardians guard, the producers produce. Correspondingly, in the soul, justice is when the 3 parts of the soul do their own work. Plato famously divides the soul into 3 parts. The rational part, which sort of corresponds with the ruler, the spirited part, which corresponds with the guardians, and then the appetites, which corresponds to the producers. And so a just soul, Socrates wants to say, is when the rational part of the soul rules, because that's its work, is to rule. The spirited part sort of functions similarly to the guardian, supporting the rulership of the rational part of the soul, and then the appetites are held in check, right? So, and by studying the structure of the just city, we then we know the structure of the just soul is the rational part, basically, your mind in a way is ruling. The spirited part, which you can think of as like your heart, is supporting your mind, and then your appetites are kept in check and controlled. And that person that is totally ruled by reason, is basically, for Plato, the philosopher. The philosopher is completely ruled by reason. Their appetites and their spiritedness is kept in check and subordinate to that rule by reason. Right? Now, if that's the perfect sort of constitution of the soul, and it corresponds to the constitution of the perfect city, then in books 8 and 9, Socrates says, well, what about imperfect cities and imperfect souls? And this is where he runs through and ranks the various kinds. And fortunately for you as students, the ranking is the same for the city and for the soul. So the perfect city is the Calopolis, the city and speech that has been described all throughout the Republic. The perfect soul is the philosopher. Then we go to step down, and we have what Plato calls the timocratic soul. The timocratic soul is not ruled by reason, but ruled by spiritedness, by the desire for honor, the desire for glory. And likewise, the timocratic city is not ruled by the philosopher king, but ruled by the guardians. So I'd sometimes say it's kind of like a military dictatorship if you think about the position of the guardians in the city. And if you read Plato closely, you can see a lot of his description of the timocratic city is drawn from contemporary accounts of Sparta. And so in the timocratic soul, or the timocratic city, sort of guardian / spiritedness rule, and the aim of life is honor and glory. And for Plato, this is just one step below the life of the philosopher. And arguably, Glaucon is a guy like this. If you think about the characteristics of Glaucon, he seems to really want things that are honorable and glorious and things like that. So in any case, then the next step down from there, we have the oligarchic soul. The oligarchic soul and the oligarchic city, I'll just say oligarchy, has replaced the desire for glory with a desire for wealth. And this is an important transition for Plato because we move to a different part of the soul ruling, or it's the appetites or the producers are ruling, right? So in the oligarchic city, rulership and the possession of rule is based on having wealth, right? And the wealthier you are, the more you get to rule, and the more respect you have and things like that. The oligarchic soul is the same way. What they mainly want out of life is money. And so the oligarchic soul is ruled by their appetite, but it's an appetite for one thing, for money, for wealth, right? The oligarchic soul could be kind of a miser. They might just, pile up money but not spend it. The important thing for them is not what you can do with the money, although they might enjoy certain things, but the money itself. The next step below oligarchy, and this is where, Plato gets, maybe you might say, a little controversial for us living in 21st century America, is democracy. So the democratic soul is ruled by their appetites, and the democratic city is sort of like ruled by the producers. But the difference between this and oligarchy is that in the democratic city, or let's say the democratic soul, it's an appetite for whatever. Whatever I feel like doing, that's what I'm going to do. Right? The oligarchic person always keeps their eye on the goal of, I want to make money. So the oligarchic person, if they need to get up at 3 a.m. every day to make money, that's what they're going to do. If they need to stay up till 4 in the morning, like slaving away at work, that's what they're going to do. The democratic soul, they just kind of want to do what they want to do. And so if they don't feel like getting up at 6 in the morning, they're not getting up at 6 in the morning. They're going to sleep in. If the oligarchic soul wants to get drunk, if the democratic soul wants to get drunk, the democratic soul gets drunk. If the democratic soul wants to run a marathon, the democratic soul decides to run a marathon, although they probably wouldn't because that would take a lot of discipline. But the democratic soul for Plato is basically undisciplined, right? The democratic soul just kind of wants what it wants when it wants it, and that's it. There's no overarching goal that it wants. Similarly, Plato thinks that in the democratic city, there's really no point to the city. It's not trying to, be a city of justice. It's not trying to become the wealthiest of cities. It's not trying to become the most glorious and militarily successful of cities like the democratic regime. Right? All the sort of democratic city is trying to do is whatever. Whatever the citizens feel like doing, that's what they do. And in the democratic city, there's really no concern to anything else. Right? Everybody is basically free to do whatever they want. That sort of micromanaging of your life that I talked about, that we saw in the city of justice, we don't see that in the democratic city. In the democratic city, everybody is basically free to live whatever kind of life they want. And so Plato is Socrates is very critical of the democratic city. And we have to keep in mind that Plato and Socrates lived in Athens. Athens was a democracy. So when he's criticizing democracy and the democratic city, he's criticizing his hometown, right? And we also have to keep in mind that, spoiler alert, Socrates is executed by the people of Athens in a sort of what we might call following all the rules of democratic process that the Athenians had set up. Socrates was put on trial and found guilty and sentenced to death. And basically, if you wonder what Socrates was put on trial for, it was for not believing in the gods of the city and corrupting the youth. And they democratically sentenced him to death for those things. And so that was that. He was executed. So Plato has a lot of problems with democracy. But he also says, if you look closely at the text, that it's also, if you wanted to be someone like Socrates, a city like Athens, a democracy, is probably the best kind of city to be in, because that's where you could find people of all different sorts and a whole diversity of people, which basically be fuel to the fire for your philosophizing and thinking and things. So democracy for Plato is actually kind of a double-edged sword. It is both very problematic, but also the one place where you could be a philosopher or something like a philosopher. And so just like the city in speech, the city of perfect justice, right, can't actually exist, and you might not want to live there if it actually could exist, right? Even though it's perfect, it's almost like its perfection is what makes it ultimately repellent, right? It is almost like it's too good to be desirable. But similarly, or sort of conversely, the democratic city is so bad, but because of its badness, that's where someone like Socrates can do his thing and do his, philosophizing. He couldn't do it in Sparta. He couldn't do it in a timocratic city. In a timocratic city, they would tell him, you need to be marching around, polishing your swords. You don't have time to just stand around and talk. Right? In an oligarchic city, they'd say, you need to get to work. We need to make money. We're not paying you to stand around and talk. I remember I used to always get told when I worked at a store, Harding, if you got time to lean, you got time to clean. Right? That's what they'd be saying to Socrates all day long. Socrates, if you have time to lean on the wall and talk to people, you got time to clean, so get back to work. So democracy ends up sort of being a double-edged sword. It has its bad points and its good points. Then finally we get to the tyrannical regime, and everybody has thoughts about the tyrannical regime and who's a tyrant and who's not a tyrant, and all of that. And I don't have time to get into that now because this video is running long, but if you haven't read book 9 on tyranny, you're missing out, because it's one of the most famous discussions in the Republic. And actually, if you haven't read the Republic at all, you're missing out. I know I can tell when I look at the discussion boards. I'm not going to say I can tell who hasn't read, but I can definitely tell who has read. And so if you haven't been reading, right, you're missing out. And, so I'll just close on that point.